Sage Wanderer here, coming at you from the Shotgun Shack in the Texas Outback. And people have often wanted to see my shotgun in the Shotgun Shack. And so there it is, my Remington 870 20 gauge Express shotgun with, I won't get into the details, but it's a youth model. Real handy little shotgun. But that's not the reason I call it a Shotgun Shack. And in the future videos, I'll tell you about that. But I wanted to wish y'all a happy Easter. I'm not wearing my glasses because I can kind of see the computer screen where most of the time I shoot with my phone, and I have to have the glasses to see the buttons on my phone. So happy Easter to y'all. I wanted to talk about something that's being talked about on other channels. There's a particular channel that I used to like. I won't name him. I will say that in Virginia, he was about 30 feet away from me. And Vinny kept saying, hey, let's go over there and meet him. Let's go over there and meet him. And I had no interest in meeting this guy because he's the kind of person in real life I just wouldn't like. His hatred for authority is so compelling and overwhelming that it outweighs his personality. And any positive things he has to say for me are completely covered up by his total disdain for authority that just seeps out in hateful goo that just covers every word he says. And I'm somewhat rebellious to authority if it's unconstitutional authority, but he just hates it because he's just a teenager that never grew up. But I won't call him out. You probably know who I'm talking about. But I will say that he recently did a video, and he said some things that weren't very true. And, he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, although his channel's way bigger than mine, but mainly because he's aggressive. And I'm lackadaisical about my approach to my channel. I just kind of make videos for fun, and I'm shocked that 30,000 of you cared enough to hit the subscribe button. So, but anyway, he doesn't know much about history. And he said some things like, certain things have never happened before in the history of America. Well, he's right in some way. And that's the thing with him. He's always right in in little ways, but he blows things out of proportion and says things that aren't true. He'll take a grain of truth and pile a bunch of other stuff on top of it. But he was talking about how the government in some state, I don't even know what it was, which state it is, released a statement saying that in these times of trouble that you should designate a caregiver for your child and put it in writing, that you should put together a go bag for your kids, because if you got sick and had to go to the hospital, otherwise your kids would end up in foster care. And he put forth some kind of conspiracy theory that they're coming to take your kids and they're going to sell them to the pedophiles. Ah! When really they're just stating the facts as they've always been. You know, if you got super sick with the flu, or let's say you had a sudden heart attack and you did not have a designated caregiver for your children, and they couldn't find someone to take them, your children would go into foster care. So I agree with the government on this one, and usually, you know me, I'm not the biggest fan of the government. But on this one, I have to disagree with the gentleman in question and agree with the statement coming from this government, because this is a plan that's always been in place. If you're a parent, you should have a designated caregiver. Otherwise, your kids could end up in foster care. And when I was a parent with small children in the house, or minor children in the house, my designated caregiver was my sister, and I had a backup designated caregiver, and I had a will that had all this put in it, and everyone, and I had release of custody documents signed and notarized, naming my sister as an emergency person. She was on the pickup list at the school, so she could pick the kids up at the school, could sign their papers, all that stuff. And so if you don't have someone like that that you trust, you've got to come up with something, or your kids could end up in foster care. Are they coming to get your kids? If you get too sick to take care of them, they might. But, you know, if you get that sick, you should call your designated caregiver to come and get your kids. But he made a lot of statements like this stuff has never happened in the history of America. As far as I can tell, in this recent pandemic, there's only been a couple of things that hasn't ever happened before in the history of America. Number one, churches have never been shut down on Easter Sunday like they are today, ever in the history of this country, even since, not since the days of colonial rule by Great Britain, have churches been shut down and told they can't gather. And it's a total violation of the First Amendment. I won't get into that. I did a video on that yesterday. That's unprecedented. The other thing is the unprecedented shutdown of the economy. Through every pandemic, every epidemic, whether it was cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, and the Spanish flu of 1918, the economy kept on trucking. If you were able to go to work, you went to work. And it has to do with the fact that back then there was a much greater number of the populace who had no savings and literally survived from day-to-day pay. They get paid today, they eat today. They don't get paid tomorrow, they don't eat. So if you could walk, if you could get up off your bed and move, you went to work. So those two things, which he did not mention in his video, are in fact unprecedented. But the idea that the government will take your kids and put them in foster care if you don't designate a caregiver, and if you do not, if you don't, you know, have some method to take care of them, a family member that is willing to step in quickly, they're going to end up in foster care. And that's just, do you want your kids home alone trying to scrap for cereal and milk and taking care of themselves? It's Lord of the Flies up in there. No. So I think his alarm, and anybody else that's alarmed by this concept, is just not thinking it through all the way. And but I want to say that the idea that this kind of medical tyranny has never happened in this country before, in some cases, is completely untrue. It has. And so in that, I'm a storyteller. So in that vein, I'm going to tell you a personal story of my grandmother. Not the one that's 105, but the one that died at 92. And she was born during actually before the Great Depression. So she was a teenager during the Great Depression. And many families couldn't afford to feed their own children during the Great Depression. And they had to find ways. They would send them to other family members. They would send them out to friends of family or family who had farms and put them to work as young teenagers or even children to earn their keep. And my grandmother's family in Oklahoma was no exception. And so they farmed at the age of 16. They farmed my grandmother out of the house so that because they couldn't afford to feed her anymore. And so they literally gave her to a neighbor who had a job and some money. And he was a single man living alone, and he hired her on as a housekeeper at the age of 16. Does that sound kind of shady? Well, it was the 1930s, so it was kind of shady by today's standards. Now, what happens when a 25-year-old man has a 16-year-old girl in the house, and they're in their house alone? Well, it just depends on the ethics of the man now, doesn't it? So everything went along pretty well, but somewhere around 17, halfway through her 17th year, my grandmother succumbed to his advances, and they started sleeping together, and she came up pregnant. And so when her family found out about it, they showed up at Earl's house with a shotgun or shotguns and said, "Hey, we didn't send her over here for you to knock her up. If you're going to do this, you need to marry her." Well, it was the Great Depression in rural Oklahoma, and so they didn't have a church wedding. They had a thing called jumping the broom. More evidence that the grandfather in question, Earl, was in fact African American, passing as a Native American in Oklahoma, and he was 25% by the DNA records, as best I can tell. He was around 25%, 20%, something like that, African American, but passing as a Native. And so they jumped the broom. They had a wedding ceremony. And when my grandmother was about 18, and she was almost ready to have the baby, well, she did have the baby. And just days after she had the baby, Earl, and they named the baby Earl, and that's the old Marine. The old Marine was the second Earl. Actually, he's the fourth Earl in our family. in a long line succession of earls. Another story altogether, but it has to do with the fact that we're related to royalty, that we're descended from earls. But at any rate, um, when Earl Sr. Saw Earl Jr. there, I guess he got a little bit of cold feet and decided he was going to escape the situation, and he went away to Tulsa to find work and never came back. And so when the rent came due and it wasn't paid, they kicked my grandmother out with a brand new baby. Her family still couldn't feed her, so she started a cross-country trek to Arkansas where there was family there that said that they would take her in. So she started crossing the state of Oklahoma on foot. She didn't make it all the way because she was starving to death, and she found a farmer along the way who hired her to feed the cows that he kept. And in turn, her payment was she got to eat the cow feed. So she fed herself on the basically corn and whatever oats that were fed to the cows. She ate those right out of the cow feed bin, and ground it up into cornmeal and made cornbread and, and oatmeal for herself. And my father, as an infant, was breastfed. And this farmer, this is going to be a long story, bear with me. This farmer had a herd of goats, and a baby goat was born, and the mother goat died in childbirth, giving birth to the baby goat. And my grandmother talked the farmer into letting her raise the baby goat. You might ask, what did she feed the baby goat? This is a true Sage Wanderer story. You can't make this stuff up. And I often tease my dad that his half brother was a goat. But she breastfed this baby goat right alongside my dad. And he breastfed side by side with a baby goat. And she raised this goat up. And it wasn't a billy goat. It was a female goat. And then she was able to get it bred. And it had a bunch of babies. And she had a herd of goats. But it was spring came, and it was time for her to. Well, it was summer came, and it was time for her to leave because she wintered there. So my dad was born in August, so I think she was September. She fed the goats fed the cows and goats through the winter, and she left a herd of goats in eastern Oklahoma, and there's still a wild herd of goats in eastern Oklahoma that they hunt like deer. You can probably look that up somewhere. I think they're still there. They were when I was a young man, because I did the research on it and found out about these wild goats of eastern Oklahoma. But she did find family in Arkansas, and even though by this time World War II had broken out, by the time my father was a little boy, and all of the available men for husbands were sent off to war, but there was a 4F man who was a World War I veteran whose name was Noah, and he had a steel plate in his head from a grenade attack in the trench warfare in France in World War I. And unbeknownst to a lot of people, he was suffering from tuberculosis. So my grandmother took care of him. He was a violent, angry man. He hated my father, Earl, the old Marine, when he was a baby, but he hated him so bad because he wasn't his kid. My grandmother had 5 more children with Noah, and all of my uncles and aunts are my half uncles and aunts. And they are not from African American descent like my family is, like I am. Mostly I'm white. I'm 97% European, but that's for another story. You can see that in my DNA fiasco folder if you'd like to check out that story of my ethnic makeup. But the fact of the matter is Noah had tuberculosis, and they were constantly trying to snatch up people and put them in the sanitariums where they were basically confined under quarantine against their will. And the health department would show up with the sheriff, and they would take you at gunpoint. They would grab you, hand and foot, hog tie you, and carry you off to the TB hospital, and that's where you would stay until you died or recovered. And this is a medical tyranny that's a part of our history. This kind of thing could happen again, kind of is happening now on a much larger scale to a lot of people who aren't sick, that they're just afraid might get sick. And I'm very much opposed to what's going on. In fact, this story from my family as a young man, I got so mad I'd throw things and scream every time I heard the story. But it is a part of my family history. And Grandma kept Earl's not Earl, I'm sorry, but Noah's diagnosis quiet while she cared for him, and they did not find out about him. And when he got too sick to go to work, my dad, at the age of 10 years old, took the old Noah's mule and rode it to the sawmill and convinced the sawmill man to let my dad at 10 years old work Noah's shift at the sawmill so the family could keep eating during rationing and the events that were going on in World War II. And so eventually Noah died of tuberculosis and was buried. And that's when public health officials in Arkansas found out that Noah had the tuberculosis. And therefore, by that time, my grandmother had acquired the tuberculosis as well and had symptoms. And they were about to snatch her up and put her in the hospital. And so she snatched up her 5 kids. By then, my father was 13. The old Marine was 13. He'd ran away from home because Noah hated him. Noah tried to kill him on numerous occasions, and Noah would drink heavily because of the tuberculosis and the pain. And one of the common stories of my dad's childhood, and one of the reasons he was quite mean, is because he spent his 6-year-old to 13-year-old life many nights being chased around the Arkansas woods by Noah with an axe saying, come out, Ellen's little bastard. I hate to use that word, but that's what he called him because he hated that he wasn't the father of that kid. He was raising somebody else's kid. And he wanted Earl Jr., just known as Junior at that point. He wanted Junior dead. Of course, eventually my grandma had enough of him, and before Noah died, my grandmother sewed him up in a sheet while he was sleeping it off. And she beat him with the broomstick until he was almost dead. And then she let him know that if he ever laid a hand on her, because he used to beat her too, or on any of her children, and especially Earl Jr., that she'd kill him, that she'd sew him up in that bed sheet, and she'd just cut his throat while he was sleeping. And he kind of left him alone, but at the same time, my dad being 13, he ran away to the panhandle of Texas and worked picking cotton and baling hay and doing other various jobs for a couple more years until at the age of 15, Noah finally died. The health officials were coming after my grandma rather, and they headed out to Oregon. They escaped to Oregon. And my grandmother lived there and got her kids a little older. Earl Jr. became a Marine, went away to fight in Korea and trained Korean Marines to fight. They would go on to fight in Vietnam, many of those men that he trained in Korea. And to do covert ops in Vietnam before it was Vietnam. But in what interrupted the old Marine's career as a Marine is that the health department finally caught up to Grandma. And they snatched her out of the house in Oregon, and they put her in an Oregon Sanitarium TB hospital against her will. And they pulled the children out of the house. And because there wasn't a really good foster child system back then, and orphanages were already full due to World War II and the Great Depression and all those things, that by the 1950s, they much more preferred to have a family member take care of them. So the old Marine received a hardship discharge, and he was brought back from Japan and Korea to care for his minor brothers and sisters, his half brothers and sisters, since he was the oldest. And he still had, I guess my Uncle Morris was probably in his, was probably in grade school, like second grade, when the old Marine came back on a hardship discharge from the Marine Corps to raise his siblings as their father. So my mother and father raised my father's little brothers and sisters, finished raising them while my grandma was in the sanitarium hospital, where they, against her will, removed one of her lungs surgically. So here is your Easter miracle. You waited 19 and a half minutes for this. And this is one of the great miracles of our family. And I should have told this story before. But they removed my grandmother's lung that was eaten up with tuberculosis in surgery. And then that seemed to have stopped the disease. And she was allowed to go home. Well, in a follow-up, examination, they did an X-ray to check her and see if the tuberculosis had came back and to see how the missing lung was healing. When, to their astonishment, she had grown another lung. That this woman, who they know they had surgically removed a diseased lung from, had grown another lung to replace it. She had a new, healthy, pink, young looking, never before used lung. She grew a second lung. It was a miracle. It's a documented medical miracle. She had many uh, uh, follow up examinations and follow up x rays. And they even accused the surgeon of messing up and not removing the lung. And they had an investigation. And the nurse that was there during the surgery testified under oath that she saw him remove a diseased tuberculosis ridden lung from my grandmother. And the X-ray showed that she had two perfectly healthy lungs. So this channel is not one of those places that believes this is fake. I do believe the government is hyping this up. The deep state is hyping this up and making it a big deal. But I don't believe that the numbers are off. I believe people are dying. I've seen their diary vlogs on YouTube where they weep and cry because their family member died alone and they weren't even allowed to go and visit them. And I've seen the pictures in New York of the mass graves that are being buried three on top of each other. You know, some say by prisoners who are being paid $6 an hour to bury these bodies on an island off the state of New York. So I do believe that this is a real virus. It is a health crisis. This is a time, though, that we should stand up for our rights. I was infuriated that they locked my grandma up and cut her lung out, even though that happened long before I was ever born. Um, and I would say that if you have children, find someone now who can take care of them and find a backup for that person. Or your kids are going to end up in foster care because you really don't want them fighting over Cheerios now, do you? So that's my Easter message for the day: the miracle of my grandma regrowing her lung. And yes, this is the same grandma who was the midwife who had the creepiest story I've ever heard about the dog babies. Yeah, you might have seen that video. But I know this is a fact. My grandmother had copies of her x-rays before and after showing the diseased lung and then the healthy lung that replaced it. And there was even x-rays taken after the surgery and before the lung grew back of her with just one lung. So this was not a clerical error. It was a medically documented uh, miracle. So there is your Easter Sunday miracle. So God help us all in this time of trouble, especially people with children. I pray for you and your families. God save our republic.